Welcome back. We're talking about the future of China-U.S. relations under the leadership of a new United States president. Joining us now to discuss China-U.S. relations from Beijing, Victor Gao is a Chinese international relations expert. And from New York, Stephen Orlins is president of the National Committee on U.S. China Relations. Thanks to both of you for joining us. Victor, let me start with you. We just heard there in that interview with Henry Kissinger, he called the Shanghai Communique a decisive moment. What, in your view, did the communique change in the course of China-U.S. relations?
The Shanghai Communique is a very important document which laid the groundwork for the eventual normalization of relations between China and the United States, culminating in the establishment of diplomatic relations in the early months of 1979. And ever since then, China and the United States have been getting along with each other. There are differences, of course, but the two countries more or less have followed a path of constructive engagement. By now, the bilateral trade between China and the United States is almost $600 billion, the largest bilateral trade volume between any other two countries in the world. And both China and the United States have huge international responsibilities on their shoulder, and China and the United States are indispensable to each other in the bilateral economic relations. Therefore, I think when we look back 45 years later at the signing of the Shanghai Communique, this is truly a singular document which changed the course of history, especially changed the course of development between China and the United States. We, the two countries now, are the two largest economies in the world, and the better engagement, the more constructive engagement between China and the United States will not only mean good or bad for China and the United States, it will have a direct impact on world peace and development. That is the value and the historical significance of the Shanghai Communique.
Steve, there we heard Victor tell us that this changed the course of history. It was a historic time. Let's take a listen to what President Nixon had to say about U.S. China relations before he made that visit. Let's watch.
The Chinese people are a great people. The American people are a great people. We have at times in the past been enemies. We have great differences today. What brings us together is that we have common interests which transcend those differences.
So President Nixon there talking about China-U.S. relations. He was actually talking in China at that time. But Steve, what motivated President Nixon at that time to institute this historic change?
Well, first of all, I would say if that kind of comments, if those comments were given in 2017, they would be equally appropriate. What drove it in 1972 was the Soviet Union. It was the need for the United States and China to cooperate against what they viewed was a common enemy in the Soviet Union. So that very much is what drove President Nixon, Secretary Kissinger, Chairman Mao, and Premier Zhou to enter into discussions and ultimately to reach the Shanghai Communique. And what Victor said is absolutely right. It became the foundational document for the next 45 years, that its relevance in '72 remains in 2017.
Victor, that Shanghai Communique laid the foundation for what we refer to today as the one China policy, that there is only one Chinese government. How important was that?
It is very important. By the time when the Shanghai Communique was signed, the United States has a mutual defense treaty with the Republic of China in Taiwan. The United States had stationed troops in Taiwan, and the United States actually had diplomatic relations with the Republic of China, which the mainland government, the People's Republic of China, considered as a renegade province. Therefore, I think the courage and the vision and the wisdom of the Shanghai Communique was to outline this one China policy, which would guide the China-U.S. relationship in the future years, and by now it's already 45 years, and pave the way for not only the normalization of relations between the People's Republic of China and the United States of America, but also make sure that these two great countries and these two great nations, despite of all the differences and ups and downs in any given month or any given year in their bilateral relations, could engage with each other to do real business and to grow economic interest for both countries, and enable millions of the Chinese and millions of the Americans to cross over the Pacific to visit each other, to do business with each other, in many cases to marry each other, to set up families in each other's countries, etc. Because I think in addition to the common threat of the Soviet Union back in 1972, the simple fact that the nations of China and the United States cannot be friends with each other, cannot engage with each other, was illogical. That's, I think, the true wisdom of President Nixon and then National Security Advisor Dr. Henry Kissinger, as well as their counterparts on the Chinese side, Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai. We actually are eternally thankful to the wisdom, courage, and vision of President Nixon, of Dr. Henry Kissinger, and Chairman Mao and Premier Zhou Enlai, because without this bold and courageous initiative, China and the United States probably would still be estranged from each other rather than being fully engaged with each other today, despite of all the differences we still have.
Steve, was the United States very clear on that one China policy? And you know, when you look at it, Kissinger also coined and used that term, constructive ambiguity, when the Shanghai Communique was signed.
Exactly. What the communique said is we acknowledge the position of Chinese on both sides of the Taiwan Straits, that there is one China, and we do not challenge that position. That is not a clear acceptance. It's the constructive ambiguity that Secretary Kissinger refers to. And what that did ultimately is laid the foundation for, on December 15th, 1978, there was the communique establishing diplomatic relations, which allowed the United States to continue, quote, unofficial relations with the people on Taiwan, which allowed Taiwan to continue to flourish as we changed diplomatic relations from the Republic of China to the People's Republic of China. So part of the genius of the Shanghai Communique was that ambiguity, which allowed us then to have the December 15th, 1978 communique, which has allowed Taiwan to continue to flourish, which is in the interests of China.
Victor, as you pointed out, when this communique was signed, it was a very different world at the time. There was the Soviet Union, and one of the clauses in that communique said that no power should seek hegemony in the Asia-Pacific region. Of course, that was important to China, which had to deal with a militarized Soviet border at that time. Well, the Soviet Union doesn't exist any longer, but is that part of the communique still very important?
First of all, I would say the ultimate collapse of the former Soviet Union was to a very large extent thanks to the joint cooperation and efforts by the United States and China since the early 1970s. This is a very, very important historical development in world history, probably ever since mankind started to write history. That's number one. Number two is that now that the international situation has been completely changed, China now is just next to the United States as the second largest economy. China is actually the largest economy if we use the purchasing power parity as the benchmark. So how would China and the United States continue to engage with each other as partners, as trading partners, etc., in many sense of the word? This is very important. And I think the Shanghai Communique, as well as the following communiques between China and the United States, emphasizing on the one China, leaving certain strategic ambiguity in between the lines, for example, enable both China and the United States to be flexible enough to engage with each other despite of all these differences. This kind of spirit still need to guide China and the United States today in the Trump presidency. And we hope all of us can reflect on the wisdom, vision, and courage of the Shanghai Communique and make sure that the course of development between China and the United States will be kept steady, and it will be in our mutual interest, and it will be stabilizing our world peace and development. War is not an option between China and the United States. In China, there is no hostility against the United States.
I think the United States is in the process. I'm no Russia expert, but clearly President Trump is looking to have a reset of the relationship with Russia. There's considerable division within the United States political community between the Congress and President Trump, between the intelligence agencies and President Trump in terms of what U.S. policy should be. But clearly there's going to be some rearrangement of the chess pieces of the world between the United States, China, and Russia.
Right.
So it'll be a more balanced relationship, my guess is, under President Trump.
Steve, when Victor talks about that spirit in the relationship between the United States and China, do you think it's still there? I mean, these two countries have some significant differences. If we look at recent differences on issues like the South China Sea, on how to handle the nuclear program in the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, or the deployment of the THAAD missile system, are they going to exercise that spirit again, get past these differences?
I think the spirit has to some degree dissipated. That as a result of the South China Sea, as a result of a perception that China has not done enough, or North Korea as a result of a bilateral trade deficit that is enormous, that the constituencies which formerly supported constructive engagement have become less supportive. The think tank community, the business community, is not only the trade deficit, but the view that they are discriminated against in terms of investment in China, in terms of access to the Chinese market versus Chinese companies' access to the United States market. There has been a diminution in support for constructive engagement. So what we have at the National Committee on U.S. China Relation do every day is make sure that the U.S. public, the U.S. leaders are educated on what is going on in the U.S. China relationship.
What are your thoughts, Victor? Is there still a lot of work that needs to be done to get back that spirit that you talked about?
Definitely. I think China-U.S. relations on the political side, at least, is in a very complicated and sensitive stage, especially when President Donald Trump came into the White House. And the challenges are real challenges. We do have major differences on many issues, not only between China and the United States themselves, but also on major international hot issues in the world. However, I think the spirit of engagement still remains a valid one because, as Dr. Henry Kissinger mentioned, a war is not an option. And China and the United States are almost shoulder to shoulder with each other if we can see more and more eye to eye on major international issues. I'm pretty sure that these issues can be better resolved at lower cost and to the better benefits of all the people in China and the United States, as well as the people in the world. If China and the United States fail to see more and more eye to eye on major issues in the world will have less peace and less development and less stability. That's, I think, a logical conclusion all the people with decency of the mind can draw up. And this should be the raison d'etre of the China-U.S. relations going forward. No one will win between China or the United States if hostility flares up. We can both become winners if friendship is more strengthened between China and the United States.
Go ahead, Steve.
It's not that black and white. It's not a question of hostility or not hostility, but there's just going to be, there is a perception in the United States of what I would call a lack of reciprocity. And it's not only a question of trade, it's a question of investment, it's a question of media. In other words, here we are sitting here and freely broadcasting from New York and Washington on a Chinese-owned media outlet. Could a similar media outlet broadcast in China? And the answer is no. And there's a perception that that is fundamentally unfair.
Victor, what is the Chinese response to that? The Chinese State Counsel, Ang Jiechi, is in the country. He's going to be here for 2 days at the invitation of the United States. That's a very high-level visit, the most senior-level visit by a Chinese official to the United States. What do you see happening?
I wish State Councilor Yang Jiechi all the good luck in his discussions with Secretary of State Rex Tillerson and other important U.S. government leaders. This kind of exchange and dialogue between China and the United States at the very top level are very, very important in enabling each other to understand the differences and to apply a steady hand to avoid, major disruptions of relations between China and the United States. I heard Stephen's point. Between China and the United States, yes, indeed, there are imperfections. There are major problems that we need to make joint efforts to overcome. As a matter of fact, in reality, there are more American bank branches in China than Chinese bank branches in the United States. So both our two countries need to bend backward to make sure that more cooperation will be good for both China and the United States. More exchanges, more dialogues, etc., will be better for each other. In China, there is a fundamental concern that what the United States do may actually cause color revolution in China or regime change in China, etc. So it is very much directed at the survival and the sustainability of the political system and the country as a whole. Therefore, I think both China and the United States need to better understand each other, and the exchange and the dialogue that State Councilor Yang Jiechi is doing in the United States is absolutely what's necessary and essential for better and more constructive relations between China and the United States.
And that's where we have to leave it. Victor Gao, Steve Orlins, thanks to both of you for joining us.